Hi, my name is Peter Andras. I'm a professor at Edinburgh Napier University. This is my lecture series on the evolution of complex systems. This is lecture 11, Advanced Concepts. This is part 1 of lecture 11. So far, we looked at a number of complex systems, both in biological and social context. And we started with the defining of what we mean by abstract communication systems and how these abstract communication systems approach can help to understand how these various complex systems are structured and behave. Now, in this lecture and the following lecture, we will look at how we can pull out the key abstract concepts from these discussions, which are important for the growth, expansion, and maintenance of these complex systems. So first we will look at the limits of the expressivity of communications in the context of complex system. Then we will consider how simplification and of a language links to the expansion of the complex systems. Next, we move on to consider structures, constraints, and the generation of institutes in general in the context of complex systems. And finally, we will look at professional languages in the context of these institutes. So let's start with human language. If you consider how you speak human language, how you use words after word, sentence after sentence, there are continuation distributions which tell you what possible continuations are allowed. Now, just for example, you may consider the recently introduced transformers, which are used in natural language processing, in particular in generation of natural language-like text. And these use these kind of continuation distributions to generate human-like text automatically. Now, in terms of formalism, let's denote by sigma, capital sigma, the symbol set that is used in the language. Let's say X is a communication, and X reduced to sigma, smaller lowercase sigma, are the symbols that are part of the capital sigma. By Px given Rx, we give the continuation distribution for x given Rx, which is the set of the references. We also use the concept of temporal order, x bigger than y, meaning x happens after y, which implies that y is part of Tx, where Tx is the set of all communications within a system that happen before x. Then, of course, if z is part of Ty and y is part of Tx, then we can conclude that z is part of Tx. And in general, the Rx, the reference set for the generation of communication x, is always part and is a subset of Tx. Now, in communication systems, as we said, the communication units generate the communications, and sometimes they generate communications apparently randomly or spontaneously. So, for example, if you consider in the context of the nervous system, the neurons interact, and sometimes neuron generates spikes, which are generated spontaneously, given what happens within the neuron. But as I said, we ignore this from the perspective of the systems analysis. So we see the neuron as an abstract communication unit. So there are generated these random spikes, spontaneous spikes. And of course, these are meaningless in the context of the nervous system. But in the same way, in any complex systems, there are a number of spontaneous communications, random communications that are generated which do not fit the context of the system. Now, for the sake of simplification, we assume that the likelihood of generation of any random communication is the same, irrespective of the communication itself. However, of course, in general, the random generation of communication X, it always depends on what happened before the communication X is generated, what happened before in terms of communications within the system. And given that past, there is a random chance of generating communication X. Now, as we said, the random communications are meaningless, and in general, those communications are meaningless which do not follow the rules. So these are the random communications, but also zero likelihood communications. So when the constraints on the continuation distributions are such that they exclude some communication, if these are generated, they must be generated as random communications because they do not follow the system rules. Now, there, of course, a random communication might effectively mean that there is something changed inside of the communication unit which generates a new communication that doesn't fit the system. However, from the system's perspective, that is seen as a random communication. So then we get to the question of how long can be the sequences and patterns of referencing communications such that they do not appear to be random. So clearly, as you add more communications in a sequence, it is more likely to add the whole sequence to appear random and the final communication to appear random. So if you use the notation on the screen, so let's say xn, xn minus 1, and x1, so there are n communications, then the probability of xn and so on to x1 given rxn and so on to rx1, so these are the referencing sets. Now, if the question is, what is this probability larger than p star, which is the chance of generating the next communication randomly? And of course, if the x and x1 these are independent, then this would be the product of the probabilities of xi given like rxi in the context of the system. If there are dependencies, then it may be even higher. So ultimately, if this product is bigger than p star, then we are having a non-random communication, a sequence of communications. And the question is, how long can these sequences be? Now, if you have a richer symbol set in a system, then it is more likely to generate one of the non-correct communications. So if you have n different symbols, you have n minus 1 opportunities to generate the wrong communications. So the likelihood of generating a random communication is higher if you have a wider set of communications, communication symbols that are available in the system language. So in general, if you have a richer symbol set, more symbols in the symbol set of the language, then you get shorter referencing sequences. So there is a trade-off between the richness of the symbol set and the length of the referential link communication sequences. So, for example, if you look at the examples that we considered in previous lectures, take the neurons. You have two options, the graded potentials or the spikes. Some neurons communicating with graded potentials, typically in vertebrates, while others with spikes, typically in vertebrates, but there are overlaps. However, if you have graded potentials where the meaning of the signal that is transmitted by the neuron depends in a graded way so the meaning depends on a variation of these graded potentials, there is a higher chance of passing the wrong message because there are more variations that are possible and are permitted. While in the case of spikes, which are, if you like, it is a very stereotypical graded potential. It has a particular pattern, and always that pattern is produced. The chance of misinterpreting the spike or sequence of spikes is much lower than the chance of misinterpreting a long sequence of graded variations of the potential differences across the neuron and the release of the neurotransmitters in response to these. Similarly, in the case of the brain, what you see is that in for example, in vertebrates, the cortex is more diffusely structured in some animals, simpler animals, while and this diffuse structuring changes, so there is a much more diverse structure of the cortex depending on the functionality of the cortex, while you get what is called a more crystalline structure in the cortex, where the same unit is repeated again and again across the whole cortex without much variation. In the case of more complex brains, more complex cortical structures. So essentially what you see again is a change from a more diverse, a more variable language, structural language of how the brain is structured, to a much more stereotypic structural language where the same basic building blocks are used to deliver a variety of behaviors. The same is true in languages, where you have rich lexicons with many symbols and many words, or simpler lexicons. What you can see is that, for example, Latin languages are having a smaller lexicon, but more complex grammatical structure, while for example, Slavonic languages, which have less exposure to complex state environments, they have a much wider lexicon. Now, clearly, these relationships have more aspects and they are more complex. However, overall, what you can see is that in languages with simpler lexicon, you get more grammatical structure, which is used to describe the meaning of the communications. So in general, if you have smaller symbols, that's what you expect, is that the likelihood of generation of long sequences of communications, which are meaningful communications, is higher. And of course, this brings in this question of how you generate these longer sequences of communications, and that gives you more opportunity for adding constraints and adding grammatical structure, which adds meaning to the communications. So having longer possible sequences of communications means that an increased information contents can be encoded in those communications. So those systems which are able to have longer referential sequences which are non-random are able to describe the system better, and implicitly, by describing the system and implicitly their environment, they have a better description of their environment as well, which improves their maintainability and expansion ability. Now, we talked about memories, and we said that in general, memories facilitate expansion of the system. They do this by allowing a direct reference to an earlier communication. So if you like, you can see the memory as a kind of instant reproduction of the earlier communication, allowing direct reference to that, without requiring a sequence of referential links to link back to that earlier communication. So in that way, you exclude that long referential link that might be required, shortcut it, you reduce the ambiguity in the communication sequence, and in that way you improve the reliability or the non-randomness of the communication sequences involving memory references to earlier communications. Again, this helps to create longer non-random sequences of communications, and that helps to grow the system and improve its sustainability. So we said that the information subsystems are the subsystem which processes memories and generates new memories. So these are the part of the system which processes the memories to generate, if you like, a model of the system itself based on the memories and of the experiences of the system. And that leads to the definition of the identity. These are communications which check the identity, check whether the communications within the system are consistent with this model of the system, and enforce the identity of the system by generating identity enforcement communications, which effectively exclude some communications from the system in order to prevent references to them, which might cause faults, errors, or failures in the system. So the processing of memories is effectively a combination of memories, which leads to simpler referencing of these combinations of memories. By processing the memories, you can summarize representation of these memories, which allows this simpler referencing, and again, you can expand more at the system. So if you have the information subsystem in the system, which generates this kind of synthetic memories, which combine the referencing to multiple previous memories, that helps, again, the expansion of the system, because it can generate references to a wider set of communications without becoming a random sequence of communications. So this leads to better description of the self, better description of the environment, which improves the predictive sustainability of the system. Now, if, as already mentioned, that having the long sequences of communications requires constraints on these communications to improve their reliability and avoidance of the randomness. So the structure of communication is the grammar of the language. So you may look at the human language grammar, which tells you how the words are ordered, what kind of words may follow each other, what kind of patterns certain kinds of words should form in order to be meaningful. And generally, in languages which have a smaller symbol set, a smaller lexicon, the grammar becomes more extensive, more structural constraints are added, which help the creation of the meaning through the communications by referencing these grammatical structures as well. But the same thing you may find in animals, for example, courtship behavior rules in animals which constrain what kind of behaviors the animal can do, or which behaviors fit in the courtship behavior, which are likely to lead to a potentially successful courtship in the end. But in the same way, you can see the structures in the biological system. So, for example, in the brain, where there are constraints of how the neurons connect to each other, how they form patterns of connections, circuits in the brain. And you can see that in the brains, which are able to support more complex behaviors, there is more structuring, there is more uniformity, and more complex combination of these relatively uniform structures within the brain. So the structures in general, obviously, them as restrictions of communications, restrictions on the continuation distributions, which make sharper these continuation distributions and effectively eliminate some possible continuations. So some of the possible continuations by these sharpening of the rules become have zero likelihood to be continuations. So the specialist communications within a system follow these restrictive structural rules. So for example, if you look at scientific communications in the context of human language, they fit the human language overall, but they follow quite specific rules. For example, in a paper, you may need to provide an abstract, an introduction, description of the data, description of methods, and so on. So there is a quite strict rule of how that communication should be structured. And by following these rules, there is additional meaning provided through this sequence of communications. Same way, if you look at legal communications, if you like, these are even more specific. This is the legalese. So if you look at, for example, if you buy a TV, you usually need to sign a contract and you get a kind of warranty statement, which is full of these legalese communications, which tell you quite often in a quite non-accessible language what you can do and what you cannot if you have some problems with the product that you get, or for example if you buy a house or buy a company or create a company, you have lots of legal communications which tell you your constraints, and usually you rely on legal expert lawyers who interpret this for you and translate it to the kind of everyday communications which tells you what you can do and what you cannot in that particular legal context. However, the important thing here is that these constrained communications follow constraint rules, and thanks to these constraints they can become quite long without becoming meaningless or random. So having these specialist communications within a language which follow these additional constraints, the likelihood of having these long referential sequences without becoming random is increasing. So even more expansion of the communication system is possible. And that means, again, more information captured in these communications and ultimately better description of the system and its environment as well. So in general, having structures, these constraints, induces simplicity in the communications by excluding some communications. And this leads to, potentially, it leads to the emergence of the specialist communications, which always follow the structures and follow them very strictly. Now, the specialist communication induce the expansion of the communication system because, as we said, allow the generation of longer referencing sequences. Now, it is also important to know that the specialization may also lead to the introduction of new lexical elements into the communication systems which comply with the constrained rules. So on one side you get simplification and expansion through simplification, but on the other side, as the system becomes more reliable, it can also further expand its lexicon, especially in the context of these specialized languages. Now, how these works, we had examples to the previous lectures, where in some cases we effectively call them institutions, but the same term can apply in a wider way. So for example, if you consider courtship in the case of animals, or marriage in the case of humans, these effectively constrain the communications between the participant communication units. In the case of courtship, there are constraints given by the rules of the courtship behaviors, which eliminate many possible other behaviors. And for kind of specialist short-term subsystem of the communication system within that animal community. In the case of the marriage between humans, in all societies, there are strict rules, legal rules, which regulate what marriage means, how the involved partners and their relatives and offspring can and should communicate with each other. So it is a small scale, but important institution within society, kind of small scale, strict reduction of communications and strict rules attached to these communications which regulate how the communication can work within the context of this institution. Of course, we discussed about the parliament as an institution in the context of political system, but in the same way you may see various specialized structures within biological systems and also as relevant institutions in their context. So for example, if you consider the cerebellum, a very specialized part of the brain, which deals with fine control of muscle movements, it is a very specialized subsystem of the brain which has a controlling responsibility over a large part of the behaviors generated and controlled by the brain. In the same way, Golgi organelles, the Golgi system within the cells, it is a particular structuring of molecules which interact with each other to deliver certain processing of further molecules. And again, being in this particular structure constrains how the molecules interact, and that constraints increases the non-random execution of longer sequences of molecular interactions. So in general, we see the institutions as a large set of coherent rules imposing structures in the context of language. It is important to know that these are coherent rules. So these rules do not cause conflicts between them. They do not induce the generation of communications which are not consistent with some of the other rules. Of course, this is the ideal situation in practice, that's not always the case. However, in general, the institutions form if there are a number of constraints rules which form a coherent whole that can work as a system of constraints in the context of the communication system. And when the structural rules imply the constitution of the institutions, then these also imply often the constitution of a subsystem within the communication system. Now, having an induced subsystem which can grow by itself, the institutions lead to the further expansion of the communication system. So having institutions, these sets of constraints which are coherent and have the generation of the subsystem within the system, have the expansion of these subsystems, and of course the interactions of this subsystem with the other parts of the system. So it has further expansion of the communication system, and ultimately this means more recruitment of communications, better prediction of the environment, better sustainable predictive sustainability for the whole system itself. Now, these specialist structures, institutions, lead to the formation of a specialist language. So, for example, we mentioned the legal language, which is formed in the context of the legal subsystem of the society, where the roots are the laws approved by the parliament, the various legal communications about the interpretation of these given by lawyers and judges, and then the implementation of these by the public administration and various other organizations of the states. Now, this core legal language, of course, generates communications where everybody participates in some way. For example, participating in signing of certain contracts when you buy things. But it is a very specific professional language, and this develops in the context of the institution, which is of an institution system, which is the legal subsystem of the society. Now, having these professional languages in the context of an institution leads to professional institution systems. So institutions which lead to subsystems and which have their professional language, which allows their extensive expansion and the support of the embedding system, the expansion of the embedding system as well. So All subsystems of modern societies are such professional institutional systems which have their own specific language and their own specific institutions within the subsystem which support the generation and maintenance of this professional language. Now, where this leads to is that within these professional languages, you define what is a language code. It is a code which defines the core identity of the system that uses this particular language. And this core identity defines how this system works, how the communications within the system are structured, what are the key references of these communications, show the constraints of the language, which help to constrain the communications, have to keep them on track to maintain their relevance to the aspects of the overall system for which the specialist system is employed to generate the communications. So, for example, in the case of the legal system, the core distinction, the core code is the legal-illegal distinction. So any communication that can fit in the context of the legal-illegal distinction for which the reference to this illegal distinction makes sense, those are all part of the legal system. Then there are further levels of questions. So, for example, whether it is common law, statutory law, commercial law, penal law, and so on. And then further division. So, the important element here is to see that there is a coding of the system where distinctions define the relevance of communications within the system. And having these key distinctions allows very strict constraining of the language, which allows the extension of the language, the generation of very long communication sequences which are meaningful in these languages. So if you take the legal system again, there are huge contracts. And these contracts can run to thousands of pages, or legislation can run into hundreds and possibly thousands of pages, such that it is still intelligible, it is still meaningful, and it does not become a random mixture of sentences. And it is important that not becoming a random mixture of sentences also means that it can be applied and can be used as a proper reference for other communications. Now, interestingly, if you look at the legal language, it did change over time. And, for example, in medieval times, the constructs or the contracts that could describe legal regulations of relationships and communications were much shorter than today, because at that time the legal language was much more varied. There were many local legal traditions and so on. Today, with the uniformization of the legal organization of states, which happened in about the 17th, 18th, 19th century, depending on the country, and the further constraining and standardization of the legal language. Today we can have much longer contracts, much longer legal texts, which remain meaningful compared to the ones that are possible in the earlier legal systems. So having this legal code and the kind of multi-level coding and constraining of the legal language, we can have these very long, meaningful sequences of referential sequences in the legal language. So, in general, all professional languages within institutional systems have some kind of language code, which is the core constraining system of them, which defines effectively their identity. So these are if you like, these are multi-level simple answer questions where you have only a few possible answers. And these define what is meaningful in the context of this professional language, and how should you structure these meaningful communications according to these simple classifications. So this language code overall, you see these key questions as a language code. These define the system identity of this institutional system and professional language related specialist communication system. The language code defines their identity. Now, in the extreme, this language code is a binary code. So there are only two distinctions, or two options between there is a distinction, which defines what applies in the which communications apply as valid communications in the context of this specialist language. So these binary codes characterize the social subsystems in general and the corresponding professional institutional system. So, for example, in the case of the legal system, you have the legal-illegal binary code, which is a core distinction, whether this binary distinction is a relevant distinction in the context of communication or not, that defines legal communications. In the same way, in the context of the political system, the no power distinction, whether communication leads to more power or less power, that is the core distinction that defines whether communication belongs to the political system or not. Or in the context of economic organizations, the no profit distinction defines whether these organizations fit into the economic organization context. If this distinction of profit, no profit is not meaningful for an organization, that's not an economic organization. Or for all economic organizations, this distinction must be a meaningful distinction and must be referenced by the communications within that organization. So this binary code is at the top level of the language code and defines the binary distinction, which defines which communications are part of this specialist language, of this institutional system related language. Now, as I said, there are further inner levels and inner distinctions, but it is very important to have this binary code, this distinction which defines whether communication is relevant for a professional language or not. All right, so to summarize, first we looked at the length of communication references. So the referential sequences, how long can they be? And we said that in general, languages or systems with languages which have a richer set of symbols, the length of valid referential sequences is usually shorter because there's more chance of picking up random communications, and for that reason the meaningful effective length of referential communications is shorter than in the case of languages where the symbol set, the lexicon, is smaller, and the smallness of symbol set is compensated by more complex grammar, which constrains how communications are used and also adds more referential meaning to the communications. Now, we said that by simplification of the language, the system is able to expand more. And we gave a number of examples where you can see that the simplified version of the language leads to more complex and larger systems, like in the brain, or in the case of legal communications. Then we discussed about structures, institutes, and subsystems, and we said that structures which are the constraints of communications may form coherent sets of structures, and this leads to the formation of institutes. And if these institutes have a corresponding specialist language, then this specialist language may turn the institutes into subsystems of the system, and in this way, having these subsystems, the overall system supports its further growth, further expansion, and improves its model of itself and of its environment, and improves its own predictable sustainability. Finally, we discussed about professional languages. So these are the languages of these institutions which form the subsystems of a system. In particular, we looked at examples in the context of a social system, and we discussed how the language code, kind of simple distinctions or simple hierarchical distinctions, defines what are valid communications in a language, and by these strict constraints can keep the professional language focused and make it able to generate long referential sequences without becoming random, without becoming meaningless. And we noted that in the extreme you have a binary code, clear distinction between two options, which defines the core identity of a professional language and the corresponding subsystem of the communication system. Let's look at a number of questions and answers. First, is it true that simplification of the communication symbols that leads to the expansion of the communication system? And generally what we said is that that's usually the case because simplification reduces the ambiguity in the communications, allowing to have longer sequences of referencing that leads to a better description of the environment, and that leads to more ability to expand in the communication system. Next, is it true that structures are restrictions on the continuation distribution leading to the sharpening of them? And indeed, that's how we define structures, that these are restrictions, constraints on the continuation distributions, make them sharper, eliminating or reducing the likelihood of some continuations. Third question, is it true that institutions are rule sets which may organize into subsystems? And effectively, that's what we said, that the institutions are sets of constraints, sets of structures. If these sets of structures are such that the structures are sufficiently coherent, they may organize into institutions, and these may lead to the organization and generation of subsystems. Next question, is it true that a professional language is a subset of a system language corresponding to an institution system? And indeed, this is how we define professional languages, which say that when there is an institution system, a set of institutions which induce the formation of a subsystem within the system, then their corresponding language, it is a subset of the system language, and it is a professional language in the sense of fitting the institution system which generated the subsystem. Next question, is it true that the language code defines which communications are part of the specialist language? And yes, we said that the language code is a set of hierarchical organization of distinctions, which define whether distinctions are relevant for the communications within that particular specialist or professional language, and these help to define or decide which communications are relevant, and for all those communications where these distinctions are relevant and can be referenced, they are part of specialist language. Those for which these distinctions are not relevant, they are not part of the specialist language. Next question, is it true that the political system is a professional institution system of society? And the answer is yes. We said that the major subsystems of society are professional institution systems. They have a set of institutions with coherent structure constraints, which form together professional institution systems which generate the political subsystem as a subsystem of the society. Finally, is it true that professional institution systems of society have a binary code? Well, in many cases, in the case of professional institution systems, we can identify this binary code, which defines which communications are relevant within this professional institution system. However, while this applies to professional institution systems in the context of the systems that we consider, in principle, you may find professional institution systems where the binary code is still in the formation, where the distinctions are over a wider range of options. And those institution systems may still act as professional institution systems. Thank you.